website, and my thesis is on a comprehensive case for the death penalty beyond retribution. What is the balance of punishment and justice? This is certainly not a new question, as it has been debated since the days of the Old Testament. What type of punishment pushes the limit too far, violating human rights and God's law? The death penalty has been and continues to be heatedly debated since the late 1700s, when the first abolitionist movements formed in America. The American people were reinterpreting the Eighth Amendment and what should be considered cruel and unusual. The Enlightenment period encouraged people to seek the most humane ways to punish criminals and give those who had violated the law a second chance. Could this be a moral development in society as a whole, or is the death penalty meant to be left in the Dark Ages? Capital punishment is needed to protect everyday citizens and keep murderers from committing further atrocities. In the United States of America, capital punishment has a dark and rough history used to refute the need for such a lasting consequence. However, the reforms made only support its validity. Society has changed drastically since capital punishment was first instituted in the United States. It was rife with racism, which penetrated every institution in the country, including, but not only, its justice system. However, as decades have passed, society has changed. The misuse of the death penalty does not invalidate its place in the justice system. Rather, it requires greater care in its application. Some crimes cannot be satisfied with a penalty other than death. One of the most notorious serial killers from Texas was a man named Kenneth McDuff. He murdered 9 known people, but was suspected of murdering 14 in total. While he was on parole from a burglary charge, he decided to murder his first victims. Hanging out in a schoolyard were 3 teenagers, Marcus Dunham, Louise Sullivan, and Robert Brand. McDuff forced the 3 of them into his trunk and took them to a concealed location. There, he shot the 2 boys in the head at close range before he raped, tortured, and suffocated the girl. McDuff was caught and sentenced to death, but barely escaped his sentence 3 different times before the Supreme Court succumbed to abolitionists and removed capital punishment in 1972. Instead of the death penalty, he was commuted to a life sentence, yet only served 23 years. During those decades, he received extensive therapy and convinced the parole board he was remorseful for his actions. This, combined with his good behavior, made him seem truly rehabilitated. However, a year after his release, he resumed his sadistic killing. His next victim was a woman named Brenda Thompson. She was seen being held hostage in McDuff's car, which police saw with their own eyes, but they lost him in a car chase. McDuff tortured Brenda to death, and her body was not found for 7 years. His last known victim was a woman named Melissa Northrup, a pregnant woman who already had 2 children. McDuff strangled her and dumped her body into a gravel quarry. In 1992, McDuff was found guilty and finally received the lethal injection in 1998. This deranged serial killer murdered innocent people and is an example of why capital punishment is needed. Not everyone can be rehabilitated because not everyone wants to be rehabilitated. Kenneth McDuff should serve as a reminder that some offenders are truly evil and enjoy the pain and suffering they inflict on their victims. This invokes a need for a thoughtful and deliberate solution for people who cannot be allowed to re-enter society. The death penalty should not be abolished from the United States. Those against capital punishment say it is cruel and unusual, does not allow rehabilitation, and is not justified under any circumstances. However, Paul Castle, the former district judge of Utah and author of Debating the Death Penalty, has disputed this theory. The most despicable crimes are against children. They are innocent and vulnerable, not yet understanding how the world works, and evildoers are known to take advantage of this. Arthur Shawcross was a serial killer who murdered 13 people. He was known as the Genesee River Killer because once he had brutalized and murdered his victims, he would dump their bodies into the Genesee River. He began his killing spree with 2 children, 10-year-old Jack Blake and 8-year-old Karen Hill. He raped and strangled both of them before he carelessly dumped their bodies into the river. Shawcross was caught and received a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. He was released after only 15 years. Was raping and murdering 2 children not enough to prove he should not be let out into society again? His parole officer described him as possibly the most dangerous individual to have been released to this community in many years. Upon release, Shawcross changed victim type, which is not unusual for serial killers. He began targeting women. His new name became the Rochester Strangler. He murdered 11 women by raping, torturing, and then strangling them. One of the women was June Stott. She was Shawcross's friend, and one day he invited her to the beach. Stott accepted, not knowing the danger that surrounded her. Shawcross strangled her, mutilated her body after death, then cannibalized her. The specifics of the way he slaughtered Miss Stott is too horrific to describe. Shawcross was then sentenced to 250 years in prison. Serial killers are rarely, if ever, reformed. When Shawcross willfully stole the lives of 2 innocent children, he should have received the death penalty. Instead, he was released, murdering almost a dozen women. When will people realize reform is not possible for everyone, and that the worst crimes are so heinous only death can satisfy justice's needs? Lady Justice, holding her scales, knows when mercy is misplaced, and when the only true balance is found in the finality of death for those who have stolen so many lives. A civilized society believes all individuals must be held responsible for their actions and suffer all necessary consequences. This ensures justice and serves as a warning for potential criminals. However, some crimes are too cruel for people to be given a second chance. A sadistic serial killer who holds no regard for human life must be kept away from the public, proving capital punishment is necessary for the most evil criminals. If capital punishment is abolished, the justice system fails to emphasize and protect the sacredness of human life. Failing to give the most severe punishment for the most egregious crimes risks the general public safety by making it possible for the offender to be released and strike again. The death penalty serves as a crucial safeguard for society by keeping the public safe, upholding justice for victims and their families, and aligning with the divine principles in God's Word. Protecting the weak from the strong is a foundational aspect of civilization. An ancient ruler of the old Babylonian Empire, Hammurabi, created a set of laws that is considered one of the oldest in history. It is called Hammurabi's Code, dated to 1755 to 1750 BC. It states that one of Hammurabi's goals was to make justice visible in the land, to destroy the wicked person and the evildoer, that the strong might not injure the weak. Protecting citizens' basic rights is essential for peace, and this is done through the punishment of those who violate laws. John Locke, one of our world's most influential philosophers, maintains that these punishments must be, in his words, effective and should comply with natural law principles about the amount of punishment. Locke believed that the government should impose the death penalty only when necessary to keep order and justice. Society's right to capital punishment is based on its collective need for self-defense. It is a key tenet in U.S. law that killing someone in self-defense is justified. The same logic can be transferred onto a larger scale. To keep the citizens of an entire country safe, it is logically and morally correct to utilize deadly force. Without the deterrence and accountability the death penalty provides, society devolves into the strong overpowering the weak. As author Paul Castle argued, if human life is to be held in awe, then the law forbidding the taking of it must be held in awe. And the only way it can be made awful or awe-inspiring is to entitle it to inflict the penalty of death. Capital punishment is unique in its finality, never allowing the offender a chance of parole. It crushes any opportunity of the murderer preying on more innocents. The death penalty serves as the most effective way to preserve society and uphold the duty of the government to protect its citizens' natural rights in cases of aggravated murder. Murderers who kill in depraved and sadistic ways are much more likely to commit more lethal crimes after their first kill. A study using 9 negative binomial and logistic regression models found that prior first-degree murder convictions were significantly associated with current/instant homicide offending and multiple homicide offending, despite controls for 5 forms of serious felony violence, age, and race. It was found that perpetrators of current homicides have twice the chance of having prior homicide charges compared to the population at large. First-degree murderers are more likely to commit violent crimes since they have already committed the greatest crime of all, murder. As the level of violence in a crime increases, the likelihood of first-degree murder convictions increases. They present a higher risk of not only killing again, but killing multiple victims. Once they are in the cycle of murder, they cannot be persuaded to stop. If released, they will immediately resume from where they stopped. There are multiple examples of this happening. Kenneth Macduff, Peter Woodcock, Richard Beejenvold, and Arthur Shawcross. Once they were released from prison, Macduff killed 6 more, Woodcock killed 1 more, Beejenvold killed 5 more, and Shawcross killed 11 more. The justice system has proven itself incapable of keeping murderers in prison once they are given a life sentence. Multiple parole opportunities and appeals often arise. Who would feel safe knowing that they are walking past a murderer on parole, or living next to one, or working with one? In theory, people want murderers to have a chance at rehabilitation, but in practical application, no one wants to risk his or her safety or the safety of loved ones. How do psychiatrists know when murderers are safe to be let out on parole? The answer is they do not. A former FBI profiler, John Douglas, said, "The mental health professionals start with the personality and infer the behavior from that perspective. My people and I start with the behavior and infer the personality from that perspective." Mental health professionals overlook a criminal's past actions and instead focus solely on current behavior in order to assess danger, failing to recognize insidious manipulation techniques. Criminals who have a chance of parole often join Bible studies and pretend to demonstrate rehabilitation to their psychiatrist in order to show that they are on the right path to reform. These types of criminals, psychopaths and sociopaths, are master manipulators, as shown through their previous crimes of luring a victim, killing them, and hiding the evidence. These are not ordinary people who can be rehabilitated even after years of therapy apiece. Richard Beejenvold and Peter Woodcock are examples of this, having been subjected to more than a decade of therapy. Once citizens grasp this, they will not want to release these criminals to the public anymore. What is the purpose of a life sentence with no possibility of parole? The endless decades endured in the hardest and most monotonous toil, debarred from all pleasant sights and sounds, and cut off from all earthly hope. Can a life sentence truly be seen as a more ethical solution than a quick death? The prison system has many issues that include crowded living, lack of privacy, increased risk of victimization, and exposure to punitive segregation that lead to emerging and worsening psychiatric symptoms. Punitive segregation, also known as solitary confinement, is detrimental to one's mental health. When a criminal is exceptionally violent and cannot be housed with others, he is confined to a small cell where he is entirely alone, with his only human interaction occurring when his food is delivered. It is a bleak and solitary existence. This punishment serves no real rehabilitative purpose and only worsens a criminal's mental and physical condition. Felons even have rejected life without parole when they are on death row, an example being Danny Edwards. Edwards refused to accept the favor from former Illinois Governor George Ryan and requested that Ryan not commute his death sentence. Prosecutors have successfully argued that life without parole is a fate worse than death. Rehabilitation is among one of the most important goals of the justice system. Knowing that a criminal cannot possibly be reformed and housing him like a caged animal for the rest of his life is not justice or mercy. If anything, life without parole is more inhumane than a swift death. Holding a vicious murderer accountable for his evil actions by ending his life serves prompt justice. He no longer suffers and cannot cause harm to anyone else. The punishment must have a balance of humane considerations and justice, and the death penalty provides this. The death penalty is morally permissible. Society has a right to protect itself and to take the lives of those who have shown utter contempt for the lives of others. Consequences are essential for the moral order of society and to remind people that crimes do not go unpunished. The definition of murder is the unlawful, premeditated killing of one human being by another. The murderer kills the innocent, while the justice system kills the guilty. Everyone's God-given natural rights include life, liberty, and property. If someone commits the crime of a home invasion, then he can be sued and put in jail. Since he violated another person's right to liberty and property, then his liberty and property can be taken. Whoever cravenly infringes on another person's right to life has brought his own right to live into question. Killing a guilty man after application of due process is not murder. Capital punishment is not based on retribution. Rather, it is about restoring justice. The death penalty has to be administered by the state and is not influenced by personal connections and feelings. As mentioned previously, reformation of a criminal is one of the goals of the justice system, yet some people cannot and choose not to change. Plato speaks on this by maintaining that the primary penal purpose is reform, to cure offenders, as he says. For crimes that show offenders are incurable, Plato argues that execution is justifiable. God wants everyone to repent of his sins, but this does not remove the obligation of bearing the consequences. For it is said in Genesis 9:6, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." God created man to reflect his likeness, and to kill a person was tantamount to killing God in effigy. This law was given to Noah directly after the flood. A common mistranslation of the Bible is of the commandment, "Thou shalt not murder." In some translations of the Bible, such as the King James Version, it says, "Thou shalt not kill," but that is wrong. In the original Hebrew language of the Old Testament, the word used in the sixth commandment is ratzah, which translates to murder, not kill. God can provide grace, but society holds men accountable. The death penalty has existed since the time of Noah in the book of Genesis. After the flood, God gave a list of commandments to Noah that included shedding a murderer's blood to signify that human life is sacred. God knew that this rule was essential for the development of humankind because human beings must be held responsible for their evil actions. Evil must not be treated like a disease that can be cured in the criminal, but as a conscious action made by an intelligent creature. The death penalty has only come into question in the 20th century and has been abolished by many Western countries. Should the United States of America abolish the death penalty along with its allies? Among the West, Italy and Germany were the first countries to abolish the death penalty. Their judicial histories were filled with corruption, where defendants were presumed guilty. The European Union now requires any country who wants to join to abolish the death penalty, but this does not mean that America should rid itself of an ancient right that has existed since the beginning of mankind. Americans have Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights that guarantee a right to a fair trial and due process, forming the principle that defendants are innocent until proven guilty. Despite the concerns, the death penalty is not a violation of a person's rights. It is simply the penalty imposed once application of due process has been completed. The notion that many innocent people have been executed is false. No confirmed case of an innocent person being executed has ever been proven, only speculated. Only speculations can be made that the justice system has likely executed an innocent person, but this does not require the abolition of the death penalty. On average, 43,000 people die in car crashes each year. Cars are not banned as a result. Instead, reforms are made to traffic laws and safety modifications are added to cars. If the same reasoning used to eliminate the death penalty is applied to other laws, one could conclude that there should be no laws at all due to the potential for misuse. Ultimately, there are no systems without their flaws, and laws should be reformed instead of abolished. It is impossible to say that the death penalty does not deter serial killers at all, since most people do fear death. The deterrence effect is difficult to measure with its many variables, but the proof of deterrence is not what justifies capital punishment. If the proof of deterrence was required for all punishments, then we would have to release many types of criminals. It is common sense to infer that the threat of death dissuades a person from the thought of murder. Judge Hyman Barchet of New York puts it best: the death penalty is a warning, just like a lighthouse throwing its beams out to sea. We hear about shipwrecks, but we do not hear about the ships the lighthouse guides safely on their way. We do not have proof of the number of ships it saves, but we do not tear the lighthouse down. This rationale supports a study that was done on murder rates before the ban placed on the death penalty versus murder rates after it was reinstated in 1988. It was found that murder rates decreased significantly in the states where the death penalty was reinstated and enforced. The deterrence effect is unquantifiable, but it still influences the decisions of criminals in observable ways. Famous philosophers such as Cesare Beccaria and Albert Camus have argued that there is not a moral and ethical way to end someone's life. However, self-defense and killing in war is justified. Many believe that any form of execution is inhumane, for the state and the individual can never have a cause to kill. Strangely, euthanasia is considered a moral and ethical way to end someone's life in several countries. Euthanasia is a procedure where a patient who is considered incurable from either a mental or physical condition is given a combination of drugs that kills them painlessly. Ironically, the countries who have legalized euthanasia have also abolished the death penalty. If the countries who outlaw capital punishment have found a justifiable way to end someone's life in medical situations, consistent application of logic suggests that the execution of certain murderers addresses an incurable disease in society. The United States has had a difficult time finding the correct blend of drugs for its lethal injection, yet the countries who perform euthanasia have had no issues. The problem is not that a combination of medicines that painlessly kill someone does not exist. It is that companies do not want to be associated with the execution of murderers. To solve this issue, the names of the companies supplying the drugs should be kept secret. Once America has a stable lethal injection that does not torture its prisoners, their execution will be considered humane. Capital punishment goes beyond retribution. It is a necessary tool for justice. The sacredness of human life must be upheld, and the safety of citizens comes first, especially when some criminals show no remorse for their crimes and are beyond rehabilitation. For these types of criminals, execution is the only option to protect not only innocence, but their own dignity. No human-made system is without flaws, but the historical, moral, and practical arguments emphasize the death penalty's rightful place in society to ensure balance. Without rule of law, predators roam society and prey on the weak. Law by itself is not sufficient. Deterrence and enforcement is needed, and the death penalty provides both. Just as David was justified in killing Goliath to protect Israel, the United States must protect its people from the threat posed by vicious murderers. Serving justice rather than vengeance, the death penalty is meant to restore order and protect civilization's foundational values. Thank you. The board may ask questions.
Charlotte, you did such a good job with such a difficult stuff to talk about.
Thank you.
So I wonder how you would address a Christian who is pro-life, and there's a phraseology that I've heard a lot, that if you're a Christian and you're pro-life, then you have to be pro-life from womb to tomb. So that it's hypocrisy for a Christian to say that they're pro-life, but that they're pro-death sentence. How would you address that thought process?
I would say that there is a huge difference between an unborn baby who has committed no sin and a vicious murderer, and that the execution of someone who has committed the most egregious crime you could possibly commit warrants the death penalty, and that's completely different than an innocent baby.
Good, thank you.
Charlotte, fantastic job.
Thank
you did a compelling argument for the death penalty. I was very interested in the biblical interpretation of the Ten Commandments. That was very interesting. Can you kind of go over the etymology of the word kill versus murder?
So, hundreds of years ago, when the Bible was being translated, specifically in the King James Version, the word ratza was translated as kill, which is wrong because scholars and historians have gone back and figured out that there is, like, killing and murdering someone are two different words. And so the word ratza does mean murder, not kill, and there is a clear moral distinction between that is fixed in newer translations, such as the ESV.
Fantastic. So with that differentiation, right, between kill versus murder, right, I think you made a compelling argument that we have a duty to protect our citizens from that ever happening again. And so if one were to say killing is wrong, then is murder wrong in and of itself when it takes the life of the innocents? And if it is, then how do we protect society with our justice system possibly letting them out like it did in the 4 different cases you presented?
Right. I think obviously murder is the unlawful killing of someone, and that's usually, I mean, it's outside of the law, but when you execute someone within the law, that is used to protect people, not to necessarily take life for your own pleasure. And so I think that it is very important to protect society, like using any means possible to protect its citizens.
Okay, and one last one, if that's okay, I'm hogging up the time.
Go right ahead.
So this tends to be an emotional argument, really, too, for the families that have suffered a loss at the hands of a murderer, right? One of the arguments that they have against the death penalty is that it brings up the slaying of their loved one all over again. How could you speak truth and love to a family that is grieving like that?
I would tell them that their feelings are entirely valid, but it is something completely separate from the law and the justice that must be executed by executing the murderer, because we must protect its citizens, and I believe that protecting innocent people comes before the feelings of one family.
Charlie did an amazing job.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your command of justice and how that's driving so much of what you did. I'm really curious, you're really passionate about it, you well argued. How'd you choose this topic?
I like to read true crime books.
Okay.
I would read several cases about serial killers, and some of the time they would end up getting the death penalty, and I always thought that that was right. But then I would constantly hear from like my classmates or other people that how can like God's mercy coexist with like killing someone? It doesn't seem to go together. But I have figured out that like society's justice can coexist with God's mercy. And so it's just a difficult topic that I found interesting. I wanted to argue.
No, I really appreciate it. And I guess the second question is like, it seems like it is just to take the life of some of the folks that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes these people stay on death row for like, you mentioned 6 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
On the shorter end, or sometimes 20 years or more. Like, that seems unjust. I'm just curious like, how you feel about that kind of thing.
I believe that so the process leading up to it could always be improved, but we still know that at the end of the day, they will still be executed, even if it's after 5 years, even if it's after 20 years. We still need that punishment because it still deters. We can't just take it away and be like, well, they're sitting on death row for so long, so I guess it doesn't really do anything, because then you bring the risk that they can be released again and cause more crimes and more murder.
That's great, thank you.
I have a question. So I have in mind thinking about Angola as our maximum security prison here in Louisiana. One of the things Angola is known for, in spite of housing lots of terrible people, is a great revival of God happening there. New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary has an extension center there. They're training people to do ministry inside the penal system. And so my question is, what if reform is possible? I mean, you mentioned some really extreme cases of it not being possible, or it didn't work, and reform was kind of put on as a show, and then these guys did terrible things. But is the idea of what if reform is possible, does that change your argument at all?
No, because I believe that the justice can coexist with God's mercy, like I just mentioned, and they still need to pay their debt to society. And we will never know if their conversion to Christianity is ever sincere. And I think it would be selfish to take the risk of just believing them and then putting them or giving them a life sentence, taking them off a death row, and then they could possibly be released.
Did you do any research onto their history as the serial killers as children and adults prior to them convicting these murders?
Yes, so obviously a lot of them have very troubled childhoods. They either they're mainly psychopaths and sociopaths because, I mean, usually normal people can't commit these types of crimes. But that, like either mental conditions or their childhood, usually a combination of both, will cause them to be vicious serial killers. But I don't think that excuses their actions because they're still like fully aware of what they're doing and the crimes they're committing. So we must hold them accountable, even though they did suffer a lot in their childhood usually. Yes?
What if you did have someone on like death row and they like could find God before they died, but like you took away that opportunity?
Like I told Mr. Jotty, I think that obviously God's mercy and then society's justice can coexist, and that it's up to God to decide whether to send them to heaven or hell, and it is not like the state's duty to determine whether they are reformed. That's only between the murderer and God. There's no way we could possibly determine that, and we should do everything in our power to protect society and not focus on maybe they'll be reformed 20 years in the future. Yes?
I was like, what would you say to people who may think that the death penalty could be like more generous than like what a murderer deserves, like that they should live out like their life in prison with no regret?
So I would say like wanting the murderer to suffer, like as good as it sounds, is revenge. And obviously the Bible says revenge is wrong. So that's why I believe so strongly in the death penalty, because I think all human life is sacred, even if they're horrible people, and we must still treat them humanely. And I think the way to do that is to execute them if there is no possible way for them to be reformed.
Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, and this is how I want to explain to the juniors what is coming and what you have been such an example of. You did a lot of research. You offered a lot of clarity, and you were very purposeful in finding out what all of this actually means in terms of definition and our interpretation and what the ultimate goal is. I appreciate all of the research that you put into this and offering so much clarity in such a controversial topic. I think we would all say we have an opinion on this right at the onset of being asked the question, but you took it to such a deep place of clarity, and I appreciate how much work you did
Thank
making
you.
sure that happened. So good job, Charlotte.